What if one of history's most beautiful cities was built on a secret so dangerous that those who understood it had to be silenced? What if Venice's golden domes, shimmering altars, and radiant coins were not symbols of prosperity, but evidence of a knowledge the state later decided could not be allowed to survive? At first light, Venice feels suspended in time. The canals lie still, like dark mirrors. Stone palazzi rise directly from the water, their foundations hidden beneath centuries of silt and secrecy. There is no visible beginning and no clear end, only continuity. Historians have long celebrated this city as an anomaly, a maritime republic that conquered trade routes, bent geography to its will, and transformed itself into the financial heart of medieval Europe. But beneath the romance, beneath the gold leaf and polished marble, another story waits quietly, one written not in monuments, but in erased names. This investigation begins with a paradox. Venice did not merely trade gold, it manufactured it, visually, symbolically, and economically. From coins and religious icons to domes, statues, and weaponry, the city relied on a precise and highly specialized process known as mercury amalgamation. Through this method, gold could be bonded onto surfaces in a way that was durable, brilliant, and scalable. It was not decorative excess. It was infrastructure. Without amalgam gilding, Venice's image of wealth, its very authority, would have been impossible to maintain. And yet, at the height of Venetian power, something extraordinary happened. The state began hunting the very men who controlled this process. Amalgam masters, mercury specialists, metallurgists, whose skills were essential to Venice's economy and military. They were arrested under obscure statutes, tried in secrecy, executed without public explanation. Their guilds dissolved, their manuals disappeared. Their names were quietly removed from the historical record. Officially, these men were criminals. They were accused of illegal mercury handling, of poisoning waterways, of violating safety laws. Some were labeled smugglers. Others were charged with offenses so vague they defy modern interpretation. But when we examine the surviving documents, a troubling pattern emerges. The punishments were wildly disproportionate. The trials were sealed, and the timing coincided not with decline, but with Venice's greatest expansion. Why would a rational state eliminate its own technological elite? To understand why this question matters, we must temporarily abandon the familiar image of Venice as a city of art and gondolas. Instead, we must see it as a closed system, a controlled machine, a city-state obsessed with balance, economic, political, and informational. Venice did not merely govern territory, it governed processes, trade secrets, supply chains, knowledge itself. In such a system, certain forms of expertise were not just valuable, they were dangerous. Mercury was more than a chemical, it was a strategic substance. It flowed through shipyards, mints, workshops, and arsenals. It enabled rapid gilding at scales that should not have been possible with medieval labor alone. It allowed visual authority, gold, to be produced efficiently, repeatedly, and convincingly. And those who understood its behavior, its temperatures, its ratios, and its risks held an unusual kind of power. Power that did not sit comfortably with the state. Venice's legal archives hint at this tension without ever naming it directly. We find sudden decrees restricting mercury trade, licenses revoked without explanation, entire professions vanishing from census rolls. The language is bureaucratic, bloodless, but the consequences were final. Execution, exile, erasure. What is missing from these records is often more revealing than what remains. There are no detailed technical explanations, no public debates, no gradual phase-out of methods. Instead, there is rupture, a clean break, as if a line had been crossed, and the response was not reform, but elimination. This is where the mystery deepens, because Venice did not stop using gold. In fact, gold use increased. Domes continued to gleam. Coinage expanded. Military standards grew more elaborate. The technology did not disappear. Only the people who mastered it did. So who took their place? The conventional narrative offers no answer. It treats amalgamation as a simple craft, easily transferred, easily regulated. But historical evidence suggests otherwise. Mercury gilding was notoriously hazardous, technically demanding, and dependent on tacit knowledge. Skills learned through experience, not texts. Removing its masters should have caused disruption, delays, decline. Instead, Venice became more efficient, more centralized, more opaque. This contradiction forces us to reconsider what amalgam masters truly represented. Were they merely artisans? Or were they custodians of something far more destabilizing, something the state could not allow to remain decentralized or independent? Throughout history, governments have suppressed knowledge when it threatened control. Not always through censorship, sometimes through disappearance, through laws written just vague enough to justify any punishment, through fear masquerading as public safety. Venice perfected this method. The city was famous for its secret councils, masked magistrates, and anonymous denunciations. Justice was conducted behind closed doors. Records were sealed for the good of the Republic. In such an environment, execution did not need spectacle. Silence was more effective. And silence is exactly what surrounds the amalgam masters. Their deaths were not commemorated. Their techniques were not discussed. Their absence was normalized. History moved on, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something did. Because when we line up the dates, the laws, and the disappearances, a pattern begins to form. One that suggests intent rather than accident, coordination rather than chaos. A deliberate decision to remove a class of knowledge bearers whose expertise had become inconvenient or dangerous. This investigation does not begin by accusing Venice of cruelty. It begins by questioning motive. What knowledge could justify execution instead of regulation? What process was so powerful that the state chose erasure over control? And why does this moment in Venetian history coincide with both technological acceleration and professional disappearance? The answers are not found in a single document or decree. They are scattered across archives, missing guild charters, contradictory laws, and the quiet absence of explanation. Like a machine whose outer casing remains intact, but whose most critical components have been deliberately removed from view. To uncover Venice's deadly secret, we must first understand the world that made such a decision possible. The official history, the economic pressures, the technologies that transformed mercury from a tool into a liability. Only then can we begin to see why the amalgam masters were not punished for failure, but eliminated for knowing too much. And that story begins not with executions, but with how Venice learned to turn chemistry into power. To understand why the Venetian state would one day turn against its own amalgam masters, we must first understand the world that made them indispensable. By the late medieval period, Venice was not simply a city. It was a system, a carefully balanced mechanism of trade, law, and secrecy that stretched from the Adriatic to the eastern Mediterranean. Unlike land-based empires, Venice owned very little soil. Its wealth did not come from farms or mines, but from movement, goods flowing in, goods flowing out, knowledge circulating through tightly regulated channels. Everything that entered the city was counted, categorized, and controlled. Gold sat at the center of this system. Official history tells us that Venice's power rested on commerce and banking, on fleets of merchant ships and a sophisticated financial apparatus. This is true, but incomplete, because commerce alone does not explain the city's obsession with surfaces, with brilliance, with the visual language of authority. Walk through Venice even today, and you are surrounded by gold on domes, altarpieces, icons, ceilings, standards, and coins. Gold was not decoration. It was governance made visible. Producing that visual authority at scale required more than wealth. It required technique. This is where amalgamation enters the record. Amalgam gilding was a process in which gold was dissolved into mercury, forming a paste that could be applied to bronze, copper, or other metals. When heated, the mercury evaporated, leaving behind a thin but durable layer of gold. The method allowed large surfaces to be gilded quickly and uniformly, something leaf gilding alone could not achieve. It was efficient, repeatable, and extremely dangerous. Mercury vapor is toxic. Prolonged exposure leads to neurological damage, tremors, madness, and death. Contemporary sources from across Europe describe mercury workers as short-lived, unstable, and feared. This was not common labor. It was specialized, tightly guarded, and often hereditary. Knowledge passed from master to apprentice, rarely written down, because to write it down was to give it away. In Venice, this knowledge was institutionalized through guilds. The guild system is often portrayed as quaint or ceremonial, but in reality it functioned as an enforcement arm of the state. Guilds controlled who could practice a trade, how materials were sourced, and how techniques were transmitted. In sensitive industries, glassmaking, shipbuilding, metallurgy, guild secrecy was absolute. Masters swore oaths, apprentices were bound for years. Leaving the city with technical knowledge could be punishable by death. Mercury specialists occupied a particularly sensitive position within this hierarchy. They worked closely with the arsenal, the mint, and state-sponsored workshops. They handled materials that were strategic, hazardous, and expensive. They enabled rapid production of gilded objects essential to Venice's economy and image. And they operated processes that few outsiders understood. From the state's perspective, this arrangement made sense. Centralize expertise, monitor it, keep it loyal. For a time, this system worked. Venice expanded aggressively between the 13th and 16th centuries. Its coinage stabilized trade across the Mediterranean. Its gilded iconography projected legitimacy in foreign ports. Its military equipment, often finished or protected with amalgam-based coatings, benefited from the same techniques used in art and architecture. Gold flowed through the city, not as raw metal, but as applied authority. Then, quietly, the tone of the records changes. Beginning in the late 15th century, Venetian law codes introduce a series of restrictions on mercury handling. At first, they appear reasonable: limits on quantities, requirements for licenses, penalties for spills or contamination. Official historians interpret these as early environmental or public health measures. After all, mercury was dangerous. Accidents happened. Regulation was inevitable. But the details are strange. The penalties escalate rapidly. Fines give way to imprisonment. Imprisonment gives way to execution. Trials are conducted by secret councils rather than open courts. Sentences are carried out without public announcement. And crucially, the targets are not random laborers, but masters, men with decades of experience, men embedded in state projects. At the same time, guild records begin to thin. Charters are revoked or merged. Apprenticeship lists stop abruptly. Technical manuals referenced in earlier inventories vanish from later archives. In some cases, entire professions appear to dissolve within a single generation. There is no record of retraining, no gradual decline, just absence. Official explanations insist this was a matter of safety and control. Mercury was too dangerous, the risks were too high. The state acted to protect its citizens. Yet this explanation collapses under scrutiny. If public safety were the concern, why eliminate the most skilled practitioners? Those best equipped to handle the material safely? Why not regulate, supervise, or centralize production even further? Why resort to executions, the most extreme and destabilizing response available? And why does gold production continue uninterrupted? Venice did not abandon gilding. On the contrary, some of its most ambitious architectural projects date to precisely this period. Domes were completed, altars were expanded, coin output increased to support growing trade networks. The visual language of gold intensified. The technology remained, the specialists did not. This contradiction is not unique to Venice. But Venice provides one of the clearest case studies because of its obsession with documentation. This was a state that recorded everything: taxes, ship manifests, births, deaths, contracts. The absence of detailed records surrounding the amalgam masters is therefore not accidental. It is deliberate. We are left with a controlled narrative. In it, mercury becomes a simple hazard. Amalgam masters become careless criminals. Their removal becomes administrative necessity. But when we place these claims against the economic reality of the time, they no longer hold. The loss of such specialized knowledge should have created delays, shortages, visible disruption. Instead, the system appears to tighten. Authority becomes more centralized. Production becomes more opaque. It is as if the state decided that the knowledge itself, not its misuse, was the threat. Venice had faced existential crises before: plagues, wars, trade embargoes. Each time, it responded pragmatically. It adapted. It negotiated. It innovated. Execution was rarely the first solution. So why here? The official history offers no motive beyond caution, but caution does not explain secrecy, and it certainly does not explain erasure. To move forward, we must stop viewing amalgamation as a craft problem and start viewing it as a systems problem. A question of who controls transformative processes, and what happens when that control becomes unstable. Because the moment the state began eliminating its amalgam masters was also the moment it stopped explaining itself. And when a system that prides itself on order suddenly chooses silence, it is rarely because nothing happened. It is because something happened that could not be allowed to be understood. Once the official framework is set aside, the record no longer reads like regulation. It reads like suppression. The anomalies surrounding Venice's amalgam masters are not scattered curiosities. They form a pattern, one that becomes clearer the more carefully we examine the fragments that survived. The first anomaly appears in the legal language itself. Venetian statutes concerning mercury shift abruptly in tone. Earlier laws speak of oversight, permits, inspections, controlled quantities. But later, decrees abandon technical language, altogether. Instead of regulating processes, they criminalize possession. Instead of addressing outcomes, they target intent. Terms like improper handling and unauthorized practice appear without definition, granting magistrates absolute discretion. How does one defend against a charge that has no technical criteria? More troubling still is the escalation of punishment. In multiple cases, the penalty for mercury-related offenses exceeds that for violent crimes. Execution is ordered where fines would have sufficed. Banishment is imposed where retraining was possible. These are not the responses of a state managing risk. They are the responses of a state eliminating variables. Why such severity? The second anomaly lies in the trials themselves. Venice was notorious for secrecy, but even by its standards, these proceedings were unusually opaque. Trials involving amalgam masters were conducted by special councils rather than standard courts. Records are partial or missing entirely. Witnesses are unnamed. Verdicts are summarized in a single line. In some cases, the sentence is recorded without any charge at all. This absence is revealing. Venice documented everything that could be documented. The lack of detail here is not negligence. It is policy. And then there is the method of execution. Public executions served a purpose: deterrence. They were spectacles designed to reinforce law through fear. But amalgam masters were often executed quietly. No crowds, no announcements, sometimes not even a date. The body disappeared into the administrative machinery of the state. If the goal was to warn others, silence makes no sense. But if the goal was to erase knowledge, silence is ideal. The third anomaly emerges from the guild system. Guilds were the backbone of Venetian industry. Their records were meticulous: apprenticeships, certifications, disciplinary actions. Yet entire segments of metallurgical guilds vanish from the archives, not decline, vanish. Names stop appearing. Charters expire without renewal. Apprenticeship chains break. This is not how professions normally end. Trades disappear gradually. Demand shifts. Techniques become obsolete. New methods replace old ones. But here, the demand for gilding remains constant, even increasing, while the people trained to perform it are systematically removed. So who replaced them? This question leads us to the fourth anomaly: continuity without transmission. Venetian gold production does not show the disruption one would expect from the loss of specialized labor. Coin output remains stable. Architectural gilding continues. State projects proceed on schedule. Somehow, the technique survives without its acknowledged practitioners. Either the knowledge was simpler than described, which contemporary sources contradict, or it was absorbed into a more centralized, less visible structure. One possibility is state monopolization. Another is compartmentalization, dividing knowledge so no single individual could understand the full process. Both strategies would require the elimination of independent masters whose expertise could not be easily fragmented. And then there is mercury itself. This is the fifth anomaly. Despite laws restricting mercury handling, records show continued importation in significant quantities. Trade manifest list shipments arriving through Venetian ports long after amalgam masters were supposedly eliminated. If mercury was too dangerous to use, why continue acquiring it? If the process was banned, where was the material going? Official history offers no answer. The sixth anomaly lies in comparative silence. When we look to other European states, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, we find mercury regulation, but rarely execution. Accidents occur, workers die, laws are passed. But the targeted removal of an entire class of specialists is unique in its intensity. Venice was not following a continental trend. It was acting alone. And finally, there is the anomaly of memory. Venice celebrated its artisans. Painters, architects, shipbuilders, all were named, commemorated, remembered. But amalgam masters left no monuments, no biographies, no legacy. They exist only as offenders in legal fragments. It is as if history itself was instructed not to remember them. Each of these anomalies, taken alone, might be dismissed. Harsh laws are not unheard of. Records are sometimes lost. Guilds evolve. But together they form a constellation of inconsistencies that cannot be reconciled with the official narrative. We are not looking at mismanagement. We are looking at intent. The state identified something within this profession that posed a threat, not to health, but to control. The response was not adaptation, but eradication, not transparency, but silence. At this stage of the investigation, we are not yet asking what that threat was, only that it existed. Like loose threads pulled from a tapestry, each anomaly weakens the image Venice presented to the world. The more threads we remove, the more we glimpse the structure beneath. A structure designed not just to produce wealth, but to regulate knowledge with absolute precision. And that realization forces a final unsettling question. What kind of knowledge requires execution to contain it? Because if mercury gilding was merely a craft, regulation would have sufficed. If it was merely dangerous, safety measures would have been imposed. But if it was something else, something capable of altering economic balance, power distribution, or state dependency, then elimination becomes comprehensible. Not just comprehensible, inevitable. In the next phase of this investigation, we will begin connecting these anomalies, not as isolated events, but as components of a single system responding to instability. Because patterns do not emerge by accident. They emerge when a system is under threat and decides to protect itself at any cost. Once the anomalies are laid side by side, they stop behaving like isolated irregularities. They begin to align. Patterns emerge not from what Venice said, but from what it did, repeatedly, and in coordination. The first pattern is timing. The suppression of amalgam masters does not occur during crisis. It does not coincide with plague years, economic collapse, or military defeat. Instead, it unfolds during a period of expansion and consolidation. Venice is wealthy, stable, confident. This matters because states under existential threat behave reactively. Venice's actions here are calculated, deliberate, almost surgical. Within a span of decades, multiple measures converge. Mercury restrictions tighten, guild autonomy weakens, trials move behind closed doors, and specialized knowledge disappears from public circulation. None of these changes alone would be remarkable. Together, they signal a structural shift. The state is reasserting control, not over territory, but over process. The second pattern is selectivity. Venice did not purge artisans broadly. Painters continued to work openly. Architects were celebrated. Glassmakers, despite working with toxic substances, were regulated but preserved. The arsenal remained staffed with skilled labor. The elimination focused narrowly on those who handled mercury-based transformation processes. Those who could take base material and produce gold-like authority rapidly and at scale. This specificity is crucial. It suggests that the danger was not labor, nor toxicity, nor even secrecy. It was capability. Amalgam masters occupied a unique position. They did not merely apply gold, they controlled a process that compressed time, labor, and material into disproportionate output. In economic terms, they increased efficiency beyond what decentralized systems could comfortably absorb. In political terms, they reduced dependency on slow, visible production chains. Such efficiencies are destabilizing. History shows that when productivity accelerates faster than institutional control, power shifts. Guilds weaken states. Innovators outrun law. Knowledge becomes leverage. Venice appears to have recognized this. The third pattern is consolidation. As independent amalgam masters vanish, mercury handling does not disappear. It moves inward, toward state-controlled workshops, toward environments where access is restricted and knowledge can be compartmentalized. Instead of masters who understand the entire process, you get laborers who understand fragments. One heats, one applies, one transports. None see the whole. This is not suppression of technology. It is absorption. The metaphor here is mechanical, a complex machine whose exposed gears are replaced with sealed casings. The machine still runs. It may even run better, but no individual can dismantle or replicate it without authorization. This shift aligns with other Venetian practices. The arsenal operated on similar principles. Shipbuilding was divided into tasks so precise and segmented that no single worker understood the entire vessel. Efficiency increased, secrecy improved, dependency on the state deepened. Applying this model to mercury-based gilding would solve several problems at once. Safety could be managed internally, output standardized, and, most importantly, no independent expert could threaten the balance. But this solution required one thing: the removal of those who already understood the system as a whole. The fourth pattern is informational silence. Venice did not announce reforms. It did not publish new technical manuals. It did not explain its decisions to the public. Silence was not an oversight. It was the method. By removing both practitioners and documentation, the state ensured that future generations would not ask inconvenient questions. This is how systems bury transitions, not with destruction, but with normalization. When historians later encounter the record, they see regulation without context, disappearances without explanation, continuity without transmission. The absence becomes background noise, unless one looks closely. The fifth pattern emerges when we apply basic logic. Consider manpower and time. Amalgam gilding is not trivial. It requires precise temperature control, material ratios, and environmental conditions. Training takes years. If hundreds of skilled practitioners were removed within a generation, replacement would not be immediate, yet projects continued without delay. This implies prior preparation. Either the state had already absorbed the knowledge before eliminating its holders, or it had decided that knowledge concentration was itself the threat, and took steps to neutralize it preemptively. Both scenarios point to planning, not panic. At this point, the official explanation, public safety, no longer fits. Safety measures are reactive and incremental. They do not require secrecy, nor do they justify execution. What we see instead is strategic restructuring. Venice was not protecting its citizens from mercury. It was protecting itself from dependency. Dependency on individuals is dangerous to centralized systems. Individuals can bargain, withhold labor, leave, innovate unpredictably. Knowledge centralized in people is volatile. Knowledge centralized in institutions is stable. The executions then function as a reset. They break lineage. They sever apprenticeship chains. They transform living knowledge into archived procedure. What survives is no longer adaptable, but it is controllable. And this brings us to the most unsettling connection of all. Venice's suppression of amalgam masters coincides with a broader transformation in how power is expressed. Gold remains visible, but the means of producing it becomes invisible. Authority is no longer tied to identifiable experts. It is abstracted, institutionalized, untouchable. This is the hallmark of mature systems. They do not destroy tools, they destroy autonomy. By the time the process is complete, no one remembers that alternatives ever existed. Gold simply appears, coinage flows, domes gleam, the system works. And the cost, measured in lives, knowledge, and erased professions, disappears from memory. At this stage, we are still assembling the pieces. We have not yet named the central motive, but the outline is clear enough to raise a disturbing possibility. What if the amalgam masters were not executed because they were reckless, but because they represented a form of power the state could no longer tolerate? What if their knowledge threatened not health, but hierarchy? In the next chapter, we will move beyond pattern recognition and confront the implications directly. We will ask what this knowledge might have enabled, and why its independent existence posed such a profound risk that elimination became preferable to coexistence. Because once a system chooses silence over explanation, it is no longer reacting to danger. It is concealing it. All of these clues, legal severity, secrecy, disappearance, continuity without transmission, point toward a conclusion that initially feels uncomfortable to articulate. But once it is spoken, the fragments begin to lock into place. The amalgam masters were not executed because they were careless. They were executed because they knew too much. More precisely, they embodied a form of knowledge that threatened the stability of Venice's centralized power, not through rebellion, not through ideology, but through capability. Mercury amalgamation, as it existed in late medieval Venice, was not merely a method for applying gold, it was a transformative process, one that collapsed labor, time, and material into results that appeared almost disproportionate. A skilled master could achieve in days what would otherwise require weeks of coordinated effort. Surfaces could be made authoritative, currency could be stabilized visually, power could be signaled instantly. In a system built on perception as much as force, that mattered. Gold was not valuable only because it was rare. It was valuable because it communicated legitimacy. Coins convinced traders. Gilded domes convinced subjects. Ornament convinced allies and rivals alike that Venice was stable, wealthy, ordained to rule. The faster and more convincingly that signal could be produced, the more resilient the state appeared, and therein lay the danger. When such a capability resides in independent hands, guild-based, hereditary, mobile, it creates leverage outside the state. Amalgam masters did not need armies. They controlled a bottleneck. They understood materials and processes that could not be easily audited or replicated by outsiders. Their expertise was tacit, experiential, and indivisible. This made them unpredictable. More importantly, it made them unnecessary to the hierarchy. If a handful of individuals could produce the visual language of authority without direct oversight, then authority itself became negotiable. The state could regulate them, but it could not fully absorb them without dismantling their autonomy. And Venice did not tolerate autonomy where power was concerned. At some point, likely quietly, internally, the Venetian state appears to have reached a conclusion. The risk was not mercury poisoning, but decentralization. The danger was not accidents, but independence. Once that assessment was made, the solution followed with cold logic. First, restrict the material. Licenses, permits, surveillance. This brings practitioners into visibility. Second, criminalize deviation. Vague statutes ensure discretion. Selective enforcement creates fear. Third, eliminate the irreducible elements, those whose knowledge cannot be fragmented, supervised, or standardized. Execution becomes not punishment, but removal. The hypothesis, then, is this: Venice deliberately dismantled an independent class of knowledge-bearers whose mastery of amalgamation represented a form of technological and economic power incompatible with centralized control. This theory explains every anomaly we have encountered. It explains why the punishments were so severe. Regulation could not neutralize the risk. Only eradication could. It explains why trials were secret. Public justification would invite questions about the value of the knowledge being destroyed. It explains why records vanished. Documentation would preserve the very expertise the state sought to monopolize or bury. It explains why production continued uninterrupted. The technology was not abolished. It was absorbed, compartmentalized, and stripped of individual agency. And it explains why history remembers the gold, but not the hands that made it. At first glance, this may sound extreme. Executions for economic control, knowledge suppression through elimination, but history offers many parallels. Throughout time, states have destroyed innovators when their capabilities outpaced institutional frameworks. Engineers who knew siege weaknesses, alchemists who promised material abundance, navigators who possessed maps others could not verify. Whenever knowledge threatened to reconfigure dependency, it was either co-opted or erased. Venice simply perfected the process. What makes this case especially chilling is its success. By the time the amalgam masters were gone, no one remembered why they mattered. Mercury gilding became a background process. Gold simply appeared where the state required it. The system functioned without visible experts, which reinforced the illusion that expertise had never been concentrated in the first place. This is how erasure works best, not by denying the past, but by making it unnecessary. There are hints, faint but persistent, that contemporaries understood this shift. Fragmentary letters speak of dangerous arts. Marginal notes reference forbidden procedures. Later, technical treatises omit entire steps without explanation, as if assuming knowledge no longer publicly acknowledged. Even myths begin to make sense. Stories of poisoned craftsmen, of masters driven mad by mercury, of secret techniques lost to time. These tales are often dismissed as superstition, but myths frequently preserve emotional truth where records fail. They remember that something powerful existed, and that it was removed. Seen through this lens, the executions cease to be mysterious. They become administrative. The state was not reacting to accidents. It was closing a loop. And in doing so, it set a precedent that would echo far beyond Venice. A model for how advanced systems handle disruptive knowledge, absorb what can be controlled, eliminate what cannot, and erase the memory of both. The final piece of the puzzle, then, is not whether this theory is unsettling. It is whether any alternative explanation accounts for the evidence as completely. Public safety fails, economic necessity fails, moral panic fails. Only deliberate suppression aligns with the scale, secrecy, and outcome of what occurred. The last piece has not merely fallen into place. It has revealed an image we were never meant to see. In the next part of this investigation, we will confront the inevitable question that follows. If this hypothesis is correct, what supporting evidence remains, and how does it compare to competing explanations? Because extraordinary claims demand not belief, but scrutiny. And scrutiny is exactly where this story now leads. Once a hypothesis is placed on the table, it must withstand pressure, not agreement, but resistance. If the idea that Venice deliberately eliminated amalgam masters to neutralize a destabilizing form of knowledge is to hold, it must explain more than coincidences. It must outperform alternative explanations when measured against the surviving evidence. So we test it. The most common counterargument is simple. Mercury was dangerous, and the state acted to protect public health. At first glance, this seems reasonable. Mercury vapors are toxic. Chronic exposure causes tremors, psychological instability, and death. Historical accounts across Europe describe workers afflicted by what later generations would call erethism. Surely, Venice, densely populated and dependent on water, would have had reason to fear contamination. But this explanation collapses under closer examination. If public safety were the primary concern, enforcement would have targeted environments, not expertise. Workshops would have been relocated, ventilation requirements imposed, production centralized earlier. Instead, we see selective punishment aimed at individuals with the highest skill levels, those most capable of safe handling. Lesser workers, apprentices, and transporters rarely appear in execution records. The danger was not the substance, it was the mastery. A second counter-argument suggests economic misconduct, smuggling, tax evasion, illicit trade. Again, Venice was vigilant in protecting its revenues. Mercury and gold were heavily regulated commodities. But Venetian law had established penalties for economic crimes, and they were severe, but predictable. Confiscation, exile, imprisonment. Execution was reserved for treason, espionage, or acts that threatened the Republic itself. Smuggling does not explain secret trials, nor does it explain the disappearance of technical documentation, nor the continued import of mercury after supposed crackdowns. Economic enforcement leaves paper trails because revenue depends on records. What we find instead is absence. A third explanation points to moral panic, fear of alchemy, superstition, or religious condemnation. Yet Venice was famously pragmatic. It tolerated astrologers, bankers, foreign religions, and experimental science, so long as order was preserved. Alchemy itself was not banned. Mercury appears frequently in medical and industrial contexts. The state's concern was never belief, it was control. This brings us back to the hypothesis, now strengthened by elimination. But evidence does not rest solely on logic. It rests on patterns beyond Venice. When we widen our lens, we find echoes. Across Europe, mercury played a central role in gold extraction and metallurgical innovation. Spain's New World silver relied on mercury amalgamation on an industrial scale. The mines of Almaden became strategic assets guarded by the crown. Mercury knowledge was state-controlled, militarized, and tightly compartmentalized. Independent mastery was discouraged. In France and the German states, similar patterns appear, though less extreme. Artisans who controlled sensitive processes were absorbed into royal manufactories. Knowledge moved behind walls. Secrecy increased as efficiency did. Venice's difference lies not in direction, but in degree. As a city-state with no hinterland, Venice could not afford dependency on individuals. It required absolute reliability, absolute secrecy, absolute continuity. Eliminating autonomous knowledge was not cruelty, it was insurance. There is also the matter of regression. After the disappearance of amalgam masters, technical treatises grow vague. Steps are omitted, ratios disappear. Later authors reference known methods without explanation. This is not how knowledge evolves. It is how knowledge is frozen. Frozen knowledge becomes ritual, process without understanding. It can be repeated, but not expanded, safe, but limited. This explains why later generations struggled to innovate beyond inherited techniques. The spark of individual mastery had been extinguished. Critics may argue that this is interpretation, that absence proves nothing, but absence at this scale is data, especially in a system obsessed with record-keeping. Another counter-argument suggests coincidence, that multiple independent factors converged. But coincidence does not produce coordination. It does not produce consistent outcomes across legal, economic, and institutional domains. It does not explain why every anomaly points in the same direction, towards centralized absorption and individual elimination. The hypothesis also predicts something else, and this prediction holds. If Venice eliminated amalgam masters because they represented a dangerous concentration of knowledge, then similar suppression should occur wherever comparable conditions arise. And it does. In later centuries, we see inventors silenced when their work threatens monopolies. Engineers disappear when their designs undermine logistics. Innovators are absorbed into state projects under non-disclosure, or removed entirely. The mechanism is the same. The names change. This does not require conspiracy in the modern sense. No secret cabal, no single decree. Only institutional logic operating over time. Systems protect themselves. They neutralize volatility. They prioritize continuity over creativity. Venice was simply early. By the time historians encounter the record, the transition is complete. The system works. Gold shines. The past feels settled. But it is settled only because the alternatives were erased. The strength of this hypothesis lies not in drama, but in sufficiency. It explains severity, secrecy, silence, continuity, and erasure with a single motive: control of transformative capability. No alternative explanation does. At this stage, skepticism is not only expected, it is necessary. But skepticism must be proportional to evidence. Dismissing this theory requires a better one that accounts for executions without warning, knowledge disappearance without decline, and technological continuity without practitioners. None exists. What remains, then, is not proof in the modern forensic sense, but coherence. A model that fits the facts without strain. A narrative that aligns with how systems behave under threat. In the final stages of this investigation, we move beyond evidence and logic into implication. Because if Venice did this once, quietly, successfully, and permanently, then the question is no longer whether it happened. The question is how often it has happened since, and how much of our history consists not of progress, but of managed forgetting. That is the weight we must now confront. If this interpretation is correct, if Venice deliberately erased an entire class of knowledge bearers to stabilize its system, then the story no longer belongs only to Venice. It becomes a lens. History, when taught, is often framed as accumulation. More knowledge, more tools, more progress layered neatly atop what came before. But what this investigation suggests is something far less comfortable. That history also advances through subtraction, through removal, through decisions about which forms of knowledge are permitted to survive, and which must be forgotten for the system to endure. Seen this way, the fate of the amalgam masters is not an anomaly, it is an early example of a recurring pattern. When a civilization reaches a certain level of complexity, it becomes vulnerable not to ignorance, but to excess capability. Too much efficiency in the wrong hands can destabilize hierarchies. too much autonomy can fracture control. At that point, innovation ceases to be an unqualified good. It becomes a risk to be managed. Venice understood this intuitively. As a city-state built on trade rather than land, Venice had no margin for disorder. Its power rested on trust in its coinage, its contracts, its continuity. Anything that introduced unpredictability into those systems had to be neutralized, no matter how useful it had once been. The amalgam masters were victims of that calculus. Their removal marked a shift from a world where knowledge lived in people to a world where knowledge lived in institutions, from mastery to procedure, from understanding to compliance. The system became safer, but also more brittle. Innovation slowed, adaptability diminished. What remained was repetition, and repetition, while stable, is not creative. This reframes the glittering legacy of Venice in a new light. The gold that still gleams on its domes is no longer just a symbol of triumph. It is also a memorial to skills that were deemed too powerful to remain free. There is a quiet tragedy here, because when knowledge is erased, it is not only the past that is altered. The future narrows. Possibilities collapse inward. Paths that might have been explored are sealed off forever, not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many other times has this happened? How many technologies, methods, or ways of organizing human effort were abandoned not because they failed, but because they worked too well outside centralized control? How many moments of apparent stagnation are actually the aftermath of deliberate forgetting? We often speak of lost knowledge as if it vanished by accident. Burned libraries, natural disasters, careless transmission. But what if some knowledge was not lost at all? What if it was removed? Venice teaches us that erasure does not require catastrophe. It requires administration, law, silence, time. Once the practitioners are gone, once the documents are sealed, once the system adapts, memory fades. Within a generation, the absence feels normal. Within 3, it becomes invisible. This is why the story still matters. Not because we seek to condemn Venice, but because Venice perfected a method that modern systems still use. The method of absorbing what can be controlled and eliminating what cannot. Of celebrating outcomes while obscuring processes. Of preserving results while forgetting origins. In this sense, the amalgam masters were not merely metallurgists. They were a warning. Their fate illustrates what happens when human capability outpaces institutional tolerance. When expertise becomes leverage. When mastery threatens dependency. And it invites us to reconsider our own assumptions about progress. Are we always moving forward? Or are we sometimes circling within boundaries imposed long ago? How much of what we call modern limitation is actually inherited constraint? How many doors feel locked, not because we lack the key, but because the key was taken generations before we arrived? The canals of Venice still reflect the sky, the buildings still stand, the gold still shines. On the surface, nothing appears broken. But beneath the waterline, beneath the official story, something vital was removed. And once you see that, it becomes difficult to stop seeing similar absences elsewhere, in other cities, other empires, other eras. The same silences, the same gaps, the same insistence that what is missing never mattered. Perhaps the most unsettling implication of all is this. Systems that survive by erasing knowledge do not announce what they have done. They simply move on. They allow history to praise their stability while forgetting the cost. Venice did not fall because of this decision. In many ways, it thrived because of it. That is what makes the lesson so dangerous. If erasure works, it will be repeated. And if it is repeated often enough, entire modes of thinking can disappear without leaving ruins. Only questions that no longer know how to ask themselves. As we approach the end of this investigation, we are left not with outrage, but with responsibility, to notice absences, to question continuity, to ask not only how systems succeed, but what they require us to forget in order to do so. Because the most effective form of control is not force, it is memory management. And once memory is gone, even the truth feels optional. The story of Venice's amalgam masters does not end with their executions. It echoes forward into how we understand history, power, and the fragile boundary between knowledge that is celebrated and knowledge that is quietly erased. All that remains now is to close the circle, to return to the question we began with, and decide what it demands of us. We began this investigation with a simple question, one that initially felt out of place amid the beauty of Venice. Why were amalgam masters executed? At first, the question seemed almost absurd. Venice is remembered as a city of elegance, ingenuity, and endurance. Its legacy is written in stone and gold, admired rather than interrogated. Yet step by step, as we followed the records, the silences, and the contradictions, that admiration gave way to something else. Unease. Because the deeper we looked, the clearer it became that this was not a story of accidents or excesses, but of choice. Venice did not lose its amalgam masters through neglect or decline. It removed them. It did so methodically, quietly, and effectively. Laws shifted. Trials disappeared from public view. Guilds dissolved. Names vanished. And through it all, the city continued to function. More controlled, more centralized, more opaque than before. The gold never stopped shining. What changed was who was allowed to understand how it got there. By the end of this journey, the original question has transformed. It is no longer simply why these men were executed, but what their fate reveals about how power truly operates. Not through spectacle alone, but through systems that decide which forms of knowledge may circulate, and which must be buried so deeply that future generations forget they ever existed. Venice's deadly secret is not that it killed skilled artisans. Many states have done that. Its secret is that it succeeded in erasing the memory of why, and that success matters, because it reminds us that history is not only shaped by what survives, but by what is deliberately removed. The archives we trust are curated. The narratives we inherit are stabilized. They favor continuity over disruption, order over autonomy, and outcomes over origins. When we admire Venice's resilience, we rarely ask what had to be sacrificed to achieve it. The amalgam masters force us to ask that question. They stand as a boundary between a world where mastery lived in individuals and one where mastery was absorbed into institutions, between knowledge that could evolve and knowledge that could only be repeated, between creativity and control. Once that boundary is crossed, it becomes almost impossible to return. Perhaps that is why the story feels unsettling even now, not because it accuses the past, but because it mirrors the present. We still live in systems that depend on invisible processes. We still benefit from technologies we are not meant to fully understand. And we still accept that certain questions are impractical, dangerous, or unnecessary. Venice teaches us how easily that acceptance becomes normal. The canals remain calm, the buildings endure. Tourists marvel at the light on the water, unaware that beneath the reflections lies a history shaped as much by erasure as by achievement. Nothing in Venice announces what was done. That is the final lesson. The most powerful forms of control do not require monuments or warnings. They require time, silence, and success. Once a system proves that it works, few feel compelled to ask what it replaced, or who paid the price. But asking those questions is exactly how forgotten histories return. Our journey through Venice's deadly secret does not end with certainty. It ends with awareness, with a willingness to look at brilliance and ask what shadows made it possible, with an understanding that the absence of evidence is sometimes the evidence itself. If this story has unsettled you, that is not a flaw in the investigation. It is its purpose. Because there are more systems like Venice, more professions that vanished without explanation, more technologies remembered only in fragments, more silences waiting to be examined. This is only one door. If you want to continue exploring these hidden mechanisms of history, these moments where power, knowledge, and memory collide, then stay with us. Subscribe and join the next investigation as we follow another thread history quietly cut loose. And if you have your own theory, your own questions, or your own doubts about what we uncovered here, leave them below. Every system leaves traces. Sometimes all it takes is one overlooked detail to bring an entire forgotten story back into view. History does not only belong to the past, it belongs to those willing to question what survived.